Hey everybody, welcome to another Ruby Rogues episode. I'm David Kimura, and today on our panel we have Eric Berry.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry it was gone so long.
Andrew Mason.
Hey everybody.
And today we have a special guest, Karthik Gaekwad.
Hi folks, nice to meet everyone.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So Karthik, what do you do? Tell us a bit about yourself, who you work for, and just some of the exciting things that you're working on or why you're famous.
I wouldn't categorize myself as famous, but thank you, Dave. Actually, I work at Oracle, and ironically, whenever I say I work at Oracle, everybody thinks I know a lot about databases, but I'm probably one of the many people at Oracle that work on the Oracle Cloud side of things. I got into Oracle through an acquisition. So I did a bunch of stuff with containers back in the day. I say back in the day, but it was only 4 or 5 years ago now. I helped build Oracle's Kubernetes product, which we call Oracle Kubernetes Engine. And then I started asking a lot of questions on, hey, how are customers going to use this? What are different use cases, things like that. And my boss at the time was like, you know what? You would be really good to actually talk to customers and talk to other folks out there. So now I actually do, I'm a principal evangelist. So I work on the developer relations side of things.
Oh, yeah. And, whenever I think of Oracle, I always think of the MySQL, the large database clusters that you guys do, and then also Java. So it's funny to hear Ruby kind of in the mix here, or, having Oracle on a Ruby podcast. So what are some of the things that Oracle is doing that really brings Ruby into the mix?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Oracle, typically we've been known for our databases. And so MySQL and then Oracle DB by itself. In the last few years, we've been doing a lot more with just cloud in general. So we have Oracle Cloud, and it's pretty much like, all the other clouds out there. You can do storage, networking, compute, et cetera. And we've actually been taking not a pivot, but we've been spending a lot of time working with cloud native applications and cloud native platforms. Kind of like Kubernetes, serverless, et cetera. And one thing we've noticed from our enterprises that we work with typically is there's a lot of folks that do Java, but there's also through time there's a lot of folks that end up having Ruby on there. So Ruby is supported as in terms of our SDKs for Oracle Cloud to kind of do what whatever you need to from a programmatic point of view. Ruby is one of the 5 supported languages that we started off initially with because we knew that everybody coming in already had, a need for Ruby. So we do that. Also, from a packaging point of view, a lot of our folks, when you kind of use Kubernetes or when you end up using serverless, everything is packaged into containers. So you might, use Ruby or Ruby on Rails, et cetera, for your applications. But when you end up containerizing it, you can kind of ship it and run it wherever you want. And so that's, one of the value adds of doing something like a Kubernetes or, using something like serverless, et cetera.
It's interesting that Nate Hopkins, who's also on this podcast, typically he couldn't make it today. He tweeted me this morning and saying, hey, did you know that Ruby for 2018 is actually labeled the server-side programming language of the year? This is the very first time it's beat out PHP and Java. So it's interesting to me to actually see that Ruby, even though people do kind of categorize it in the Java and PHP area where it's like, okay, it's kind of an old, not as sexy, not as fun technology, but it's finally being accepted as the number 1 server-side language right now.
Yeah, and we'll dig into a little bit of history. In my first, when I first graduated out of college, it feels weird to say this, but it was over 15 years ago at this point, and it doesn't feel that long ago to me, but in college, they kind of tell you, hey, you're going to be using like C++ or Java or whatever. So I did all this Java stuff. And then my first job was everything was in PL SQL. And I was like, wait a minute. Like I thought, Java was like the hottest thing around. And, then eventually I ended up using Java, but probably like maybe 5-6 years ago, I moved from one company to another, and they were actually doing everything in Ruby because we were kind of like a startup team in a larger company, and we wanted to, run applications and like test out things really quickly. And Ruby was kind of like the perfect fit for us because not only was it great for development, so to build, web APIs, et cetera, but it was great on the operation side of things as well, because one thing that, we don't talk about a lot, but it's a gem over there, is that on the first phase of DevOps, on the operation side of things, like everybody was learning Ruby because all of the tooling, Chef, Puppet, Capistrano, Vagrant, et cetera, were all based on Ruby. And so like the operation side of the house, when they started saying, hey, what kind of languages should we learn other than, learning Bash and learning a lot of scripting stuff, like Ruby was the first thing that people picked up. So like, fast forward to today, this is like 5 years ago, right? So if you fast forward to today, there's that common like knowledge between like the ops side of the house and the dev side of the house. So Ruby becomes a really good choice because, you can kind of help each other. Like the whole principle and like the idea of DevOps is everybody's, working together to solve the same problem, right? Like as developers, we're like, running the applications and working with the UIs and, the actual product. Operation side of the house is actually helping, make everything work for extended periods of time. But if you have a common language between there, and, a lot of times that ends up being Ruby so that, folks can actually like do what they need to quickly. So to answer your question, that doesn't really surprise me at all because there's been like movement on both sides of the world.
Yeah, and I think nowadays we are really starting to enter in this shift of the whole ecosystem and how things are served. So before, if you wanted to deploy a Ruby on Rails application, you would just push it to Heroku. But more traditionally, you would get a DigitalOcean box or, some VM. Then you would SSH into it. You would do all your normal setup. And now you have married yourself to that server long term for the life of that project. But things have really taken a shift now where having these servers that stick around for years and years on end, that's kind of the old way of doing things. And now I like to call them more like volatile servers that can just be destroyed at any given point in time and new ones provisioned on the fly without any kind of downtime or negative effects. So I know that you have done a lot of tutorials and work with Kubernetes, and that seems like one avenue. And with the cloud native, is that really where the Oracle product is kind of going with the cloud native, is having a Kubernetes instance that you can then push and deploy to? Or is it going to be more kind of like the Beanstalk instance on AWS where you're provisioning EC2 instances or VMs and having that kind of just all managed behind the scenes?
That's a great question, Dave. And like when you talked about the shift in paradigm, we call that the idea of like cattle.pets. Like you name your boxes and you're like, hey, everything lives in the sign box, whatever. But now it's just a random IP or a random box that we have. And I think that it is very true. I think James Wickett, who does a lot of work in DevSecOps and is one of the pioneers in the DevOps side of things, he once said that if you're SSHing into a box and trying to figure out what's wrong in the box, you're already losing. And that's very true today, where it's like, we don't have, ones or tens of servers. Most companies end up having, over tens or hundreds of servers. So if something does go wrong, you just want to kill the box and then instantiate a new one instead of that. And, cloud computing in general, like whether you're on Amazon or Azure or Oracle Cloud, that's kind of the philosophy that everybody's, working towards. Where cloud native fits in, and cloud native is just like, it's this long and complicated word. And, everybody has their own kind of definition to it. But basically, like to me, what that means is your infrastructure is based on Kubernetes, or whether it's one Kubernetes cluster or many Kubernetes clusters. And Kubernetes itself was like, to define it out, it's like an open source system for automating your deployments. It helps you scale your applications or your nodes, and helps you kind of manage your containerized applications. And so that's kind of where Kubernetes fits in. So that's kind of like it's your orchestration tool that helps you manage your cloud, basically. And a lot of companies are really interested in it because we talk about the Ruby community, the Java communities, et cetera, and they're very open. Everything's in GitHub, and people like communicate with each other to solve problems. And Cloud Native is the same way. Like all of that stuff is open source. So rather than spending time, working with like one specific company to figure out, hey, like what is their product strategy for this, blah blah blah, like everything's just out in the open in GitHub tickets, the releases, et cetera. It's a pretty open kind of idea. And so one thing that we have seen from enterprises is enterprises actually want to be using things like Kubernetes to host a lot of their applications, so that on the ops side of the house, there's actually wins on both sides. Like dev, there's win on the ops side too, because one of the hardest things in the past was operations would spend a lot of time understanding the languages. So they would figure out Ruby, figure out Java. But on the dev side, we're driven more by business case, right? So product teams want to come, or product management wants to come to you and say, hey, we need to roll out this new feature. And you realize that the easiest way, or like the simplest way to do that, would be to use something like JavaScript. But you spent all this time, championing, hey, we should do this in Ruby between dev and ops. And one of the freeing things from the ops side of the house is like, they don't really care anymore, like what language you actually use. You can use Java, you can use Ruby, you can use JavaScript, et cetera, as long as you kind of adhere to the contract. Like, hey, make sure that your application doesn't crash all the time, or you're actually, getting logs out of the application, getting good metrics out of there. And the whole like cloud native ecosystem kind of helps you with that. So that's one of the reasons why we're spending so much time, having managed products for Kubernetes specifically, because I don't know about you guys, but when I'm like trying to solve a problem, I want to be solving the problem. I don't want to spend all this time like trying to install, Kubernetes and getting all your clusters and stuff up and running. You rather just upload that to a provider.
Yeah. Having spun up and tried out many different Kubernetes pathways, I can attest to that. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if you're wanting to just have a end goal in mind of using it to provision servers from your CI/CD. Setting up an entire Kubernetes cluster is not exactly a simple task. So definitely leave it to the professionals. And that kind of segues me into a question of, with the cloud native Kubernetes instance, how does that compare to something like Google's or other providers who have Kubernetes instances? Is there, they're basically all the same, just whoever your provider that you like, go with them? Or do you guys offer stuff that really sets you apart from like the Google Cloud Engine?
So probably like two answers for it is on the one side, or on one side, regardless of what provider you end up picking, when you get like a managed Kubernetes cluster from the provider, that cluster is still Kubernetes. It's like a vanilla Kubernetes instance that you get. From a managed perspective, the thing that's different between the providers is like, we'll make choices on, networking for the actual Kubernetes instance. Like, we might say, okay, we'll use CNI, but behind the scenes, we'll use Flannel for it, or we might use, something else instead. So like the provider will end up making some choices for you, because you don't want to spend a lot of time understanding like, hey, what networking strategy do I need upfront? And so that's kind of one of the value adds of actually having a managed instance. Like you can go, either with the CLI or via API, or in the provider's UI, you can go and say, hey, I'm going to go get all of the stuff that I need. One thing that's different in ours and is that like whenever you, so our cloud, it's kind of based a lot for enterprises. So we have a lot of enterprise customers that, use these features. We have things like audit services. We have things like logging and stuff like that comes out of the box for free. So, and startups, we also have like a startup ecosystem, but I don't know how much folks actually use it. But we've got a lot of enterprise feedback saying, hey, we need to be able to like audit a lot of these things. So when you get, spin up a Kubernetes instance, for example, like anytime you make any changes to the infrastructure, you'll kind of see that in your audit logs because auditing is important from a large enterprise perspective. Same thing goes with like logging and stuff like that, where we'll have, actual logs and stuff kind of stored on our side. So that those are the things that come for free from, as a part of using the cloud.
Yeah, I was looking into all the stuff you guys have for startups, and it's pretty impressive. You have a lot of like good resources that some of them appear to be free as well for startups. I was just curious as why, or what is the purpose, I guess, of Oracle focusing so hard and really trying to pump out startups? Is it just trying to get them on Oracle, see that Oracle is for startups too, or what's kind of the goal there?
So the startup ecosystem, we have a program, and actually I live in Austin, and so we have a pretty rich startup ecosystem here. And then we just released our initial cohorts for the Austin Accelerator program. And so one of the things from a startup perspective is like you kind of want to, you want to kind of work with a large company that has a lot of resources. So from a startup perspective, you can go and say, hey, I want like 1,000 instances or whatever, and you can get it from our cloud. The one thing that really helps us from an Oracle perspective is startups typically run really fast, and they're always kind of like doing bleeding edge stuff. And it helps us kind of like from a product perspective, and then from a startup perspective, you can kind of like tie those teams together a little bit and say, hey, like this feature is great, but I really need for it to do this specific thing or whatever. And so for a lot of startups today kind of use Kubernetes, so it like we can actually like mold some of our feature sets to work better for startup companies, or we can mold our features to work better for customers in general. So that's kind of like it gives us a good feedback loop behind the scenes for us. But in general, from a startup point of view, like we don't really take any. We're just kind of giving resources to them. There's a criteria perspective of like how you can be an Oracle startup, and you can read more about that. I think it's like oracle.com/startup, but the startups really like it because they can get a lot of computing power that they wouldn't ordinarily get, through like Amazon or whatever.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, and definitely put it on the radar, because I hadn't even thought of Oracle for, I guess, if I wanted to go open a startup, which I have those ideas every other night, I guess, but Oracle had not come to the forefront of my mind. But after reading through some of your pages, it definitely is now. It's definitely impressive to see how you guys are targeting them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it is funny because like, in the end, you just kind of want a test bed to like test out a lot of ideas. And then, some of those ideas become products. And, a lot of times, that ends up being a startup. And I worked in like both large companies and startups before, so I know how quickly things change. And so sometimes like before you make like a drastic decision in your product, which could also mean your company, like you might want to like talk to somebody and be like, hey, if I change this, like, is there something that you can help me with from a product perspective where I'm like running my infrastructure on, or is there like an easier way to kind of do this? And you might be able to get help from that. One thing that's most people kind of think of Amazon, which is kind of like the de facto place. And in the past, I've run a bunch of stuff on Amazon, but it's hard to, talk to actually like product management over there to be like, hey, what's kind of on your roadmap, or what are you guys thinking, et cetera. So, from an Oracle's point of view, like we know we're kind of like late to the game on this, but like that's one of our differentiating factors. Like we actually want to work with folks to kind of figure out, where they want to go and kind of align roadmaps a little bit better.
And with Kubernetes, I've always used it and then also kind of seen it as a sandbox platform. So it's something where in my CI/CD, it would launch a Kubernetes environment where I would have the web servers, the database servers, Redis, Elasticsearch, all provisioned by Kubernetes from the CI/CD. And from there, it would create a temporary environment that would be able to do QA work or whatever testing that needs to be done before it's actually shipped to production. But it sounds like Kubernetes is becoming more and more popular for actual client-facing end-user production use. Is that the case, or is it really more of a sandbox environment?
That's a great question, Dave. And I think over time, so the CNCF, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they're like the foundation that hosts Kubernetes and a lot of the cloud native tooling that kind of surrounds Kubernetes. So they do an annual survey. So every year they kind of ask a bunch of questions. And so this year, and the one thing that we kind of keep track of over time is in 2013, when I used to work in a startup called Stack Engine, we would kind of ask like, hey, do you run containers? This is kind of pre-Kubernetes, but like, do you run containers, and then do you run containers in production? And then when Kubernetes got really hot, they were like, hey, do you run Kubernetes? And a lot of people would be like, yeah, we run our dev instances on there, and then we might do some testing on there. And then the other question that was typically asked is, do you actually run Kubernetes in production? And so over time, like initially it was like 10%. And I think last year they were saying that there were like 40% of the people that run Kubernetes, or like it was like 40 or 48%, but 40% of folks actually run Kubernetes from a production standpoint. So they're actually running like real life workloads that customers are kind of interacting with. And over time, Kubernetes is I think it's at like version 113. I don't know if 114 is released yet, but initially like it was a little bit unstable. Things would change a lot, but Kubernetes has become a pretty solid platform. So like once you install it and you have it up and running, it takes a lot to actually like break it these days, where it used to be kind of brittle before. And stability used to be like one of the biggest concerns to actually run like a platform for your production applications. But now that it's a lot more stable and, you can kind of run it for weeks and months at end, like people are more comfortable running like production workloads on there. So, it's like in the 40s right now. And I think when they do the survey again next year, it'll probably be up in the 60s. So there's like a huge kind of enterprise push towards Kubernetes. And I think that's like one of the, like a win for that whole ecosystem. The one thing is like, when I give talks at conferences and stuff like that, people kind of talk about Kubernetes, but there's also like other ways you can kind of do that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I looked up that article in CNCF, and I'm actually shocked to see that Kubernetes has taken that big of a storm. It seems to be definitely growing more and more popular. As far as Kubernetes, if someone wants to get started with that, how do they even start? So, let's say if they were going with the cloud native option or the Oracle Cloud, where would they go to get started? And what are some things that they may not know if they are coming from a traditional, normal virtual machine instance and, SSHing in to do deployments and stuff? What are some things that people should know to get started?
From an Oracle perspective, like I would, the easiest way to get started with Kubernetes is not to actually do the self-install yourself, but it would be to get like a managed service. So from an Oracle point of view, you go to cloud.oracle.com. You have like a, try it now kind of thing. So you can go get some credits and then run, go into the, Oracle console, Oracle Cloud Console, and then just select Kubernetes from there and, get your 3-node cluster up and running. So that way you're kind of like within 5 minutes, you've like registered for an account and like actually got a Kubernetes cluster up and running. So you're, trying to do Kubernetes specific things. From a Kubernetes learning perspective, there's kind of a learning curve over there as well. I gave a talk at KubeCon this year with the guy, his name is Deependra Khare, and he works on a company called Cloud, which is a consulting company, but also it's a training kind of company. And he wrote the edX course for Kubernetes. And I would say like that's like a great place to get started, to kind of walk you through the different constructs for Kubernetes specifically. If you have like LinkedIn Learning, or if you have, lynda.com subscriptions in your companies, I actually have a course on there for learning Kubernetes as well. So, to help you kind of get started with the nomenclature, what the different things are, because initially when Kubernetes was rolled out, it was great to host web applications on it. But over time, you can do, so much more on there because it's become a platform to like run all of your infrastructure versus just running like simple web apps. So you can kind of run cron jobs, you can run, daemon sets that run on all of your different nodes, kind of like how you have, agents today from a traditional point of view. You can kind of do that with Kubernetes as well. But like basically most of the constructs that we have from a traditional kind of cloud perspective or traditional kind of infrastructure perspective, those translate really well into a Kubernetes point of view as well. So those would be like my two recommendations. Like, pick a managed Kubernetes offering from the cloud provider to like help you get started. So you're actually like spending time, working with the Kubernetes CLI and then working with your applications on top of Kubernetes, and then also like looking at some of the training stuff that I talked about.
That's some really good information. I was actually about to ask the same thing because I'm a pretty new programmer. So a lot of this, I just learned the word DevOps not more than 2 months ago. So I guess my question is, I had a guy a couple of weeks ago say to me, I told him that I wanted to learn more about containers and Docker and Kubernetes and things like that. And he said that he suggested I go learn Chef and Puppet and the old way of doing things first, because if I didn't learn the pain of doing it the old way first, I wouldn't appreciate the, solutions that Kubernetes offers. And I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts on that. If you are a new programmer coming out of college, should you be looking at, kind of both ways of doing it, or should you go kind of head in on Kubernetes? Because that seems to be the way that our industry is trending right now.
Andrew, that's a great question. And like, honestly, there's so many answers to that, because I feel like in software, 5 years ago, before the evolution of containers, you could typically kind of like pick three buckets, right? You'd say, hey, I want to do front-end programming because I really like UIs. I really like, the experience that we're trying to create from a front-end perspective. And then there was the back-end point of view where you were writing kind of services. And then once you're like interested in doing that and, interested in writing APIs, you would say, okay, I'm going to pick a specific language to do that. And then from the other perspective, there was like, hey, I really like managing infrastructure. And so, you end up learning either like system tooling, whether it's Bash, whether it's something like Chef or Puppet, et cetera, how to like actually manage your infrastructure. As we've grown, with cloud, the lines between the backend and infrastructure is kind of blurred a little bit with DevOps. So, a lot of times as a developer, you're kind of you might be writing Chef scripts, but you're actually like also writing, APIs behind the scenes for the applications that your front-end folks are actually working with. And there's all of these things, have become like bigger things, because there's a new thing called site reliability engineers, so SREs now, and SREs actually help with, making sure the quality of the applications running are, up to par, making sure that we're like following best practices. Frontend has kind of taken off a lot as well with, the evolution of React and the evolution of Vue, et cetera. Like everything's kind of like exploding. Containers also have kind of taken up like this huge storm in between, where it's like, hey, we don't care about what language you're kind of working with. You can package whatever language in a container and run that. And you build a contract. And I think it's, they call it the 12-factor app, right? So 12-factor kind of like defines all these different principles that you should kind of be following, and that translates really well. I think that actually came from Heroku to build like Heroku applications, but that translates really well to containers. And so you like, from when somebody is fresh out of college, that's one thing I really ask folks, like, figure out where like your passion is. And it might not even be like any of these things. It might be like, hey, I really like data and I really like analyzing data. You can talk to people about like data science and figuring out how to analyze data in different ways. But I think you figure out one of those three areas of interest, and from there you can kind of say, okay, if it's front end, take a look at like front end frameworks and like different things that are going on there. If it's like back end or infrastructure, you can kind of look at more at DevOps or Kubernetes, et cetera. And then if it's like completely infrastructure based, then something like learning like Chef or something like that would be great, because that actually helps you understand how you build that infrastructure. And then from there, you can kind of like, learn Kubernetes or whatever.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And so there's some people, and I'm going to call them out, like Eric, who do not like servers, do not like any kind of infrastructure, and they just want to have their application be on the internet for people to consume. Doesn't want to have to manage it all.
You're not alone.
Yeah, so that's partially why I'm like not saying a lot, because all of this stuff, I think this stuff requires a certain level of masochism that I don't have, and that being a pure interest in the DevOps side of things, how servers work, I'm a Heroku baby. I'm a spoiled little brat. And that's all I'm using. In fact, my Heroku bill this month is like $700, but still, it works really well and it's cheaper than hiring somebody to learn and run Kubernetes. So I've talked to people before who said you should look into Kubernetes, but make sure that you understand it full time and take a course or hire somebody full time to manage that. What's your view on that type of aspect? Is this kind of an all or nothing deal where maybe it's just not for small startups? Maybe it's only for mid to large companies that can afford to hire that individual DevOps engineer to manage this.
That's a great question. Eric, actually, like everybody else on the panel, like I would also say yes, I'm kind of in the same boat because I'm all about like solving the problem at hand and, not spending a lot of time doing a whole bunch of stuff that from a product point of view, like won't matter at the end. Serverless has become this new big paradigm as well. And it kind of sits alongside Kubernetes and cloud native. And a lot of the companies, especially on the startup side, when we talk to startups, I had given like a why to cloud native talk a little while ago. And one of the questions that came up was this exact question, like, hey, how do I hire for, engineers that have Kubernetes experience? Because there's not a lot of people that already do it. So, and, it's actually hard because there's a lot of stuff to learn. And so I'm like super practical when it comes to stuff like this. So I always say, if you're like a startup and, you might have like a team of 2 people or like 4 people, et cetera. And if you're pretty small and you're trying to solve a problem, like just solve that problem. Don't actually go and pick Kubernetes and understand the workings of it. If you already know it, that's great because, you can get started and do whatever you need to. But, starting with a serverless paradigm where you might be writing APIs or whatever, you can use Lambda or Heroku or on the Oracle side of things, we have Oracle Functions, which is our platform that's very similar to what Lambda is. So you can write your applications, your APIs in whatever language you want to pick, whether it's Ruby, Go. There's a lot of folks that like to write stuff in Java, so we support that as well. And then, you kind of offload it to the provider to tell, hey, here's this function that I wrote, and here are the inputs and here are the outputs, and this is what I expect. And you guys go figure out how to run this stuff. So you kind of offload that work to the provider. And that's kind of like a lot of startups actually use serverless technologies today to do that exact thing where it's like, okay, we're not spending time actually doing all the hard work to manage all these servers. We let the cloud actually manage that for us. But then, as you kind of grow over time, you realize, okay, well, either we'll have a lot more people join, or your use cases will kind of change a little bit where you might go from single product to a bunch of different, a bunch of products. You might have internal products, et cetera, and you need different ways to kind of manage that. And Kubernetes makes a lot more sense from that point of view because you might hire infrastructure engineers. You might have, different needs for your company. And so a lot of like enterprises actually kind of move towards Kubernetes because in the past, and I guess I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but in the past, from an infrastructure point of view, you'd have engineers who were really good at managing WebLogic servers, or you might have engineers that were really good at managing like other specific kind of servers. And then from a dev point of view, if you wanted to use something new, they wouldn't allow you to use that because, they didn't have expertise in, managing all those kind of servers, right? Or those platforms. And so Kubernetes gives you like a unified platform to manage like all of the different things that you need. And so from an enterprise perspective, it's like a slam dunk because it's like, hey, you can bring whatever you want. And then we just have to manage the nodes and the actual like control plane that Kubernetes has. So from that point of view, that's why the enterprise adoption of Kubernetes is so quick because you can do whatever you want that you're already doing today and then manage on top of Kubernetes. So all your existing stuff that you already learned still like transcends on top of this like new framework. But, going back from a startup point of view, like if you're just trying to solve specific problems, like it might be better to like pick a serverless infrastructure or something. But if you're doing, something crazy where you're like, hey, I need GPU specific nodes to run this application job because I'm doing Bitcoin mining, et cetera, then it's like, okay, you might want to invest in like learning Kubernetes. But if you're just writing simple APIs, just keep it simple.
Interesting. So the moral of the story is if you're mining Bitcoin, make sure you're using Oracle and Kubernetes, right? I'm just giving you a hard time. Okay, well, where do people go to get started learning how to use the Oracle Cloud and to use the tools that you're discussing?
For sure. To get trial accounts, I would go to cloud.oracle.com, and that's kind of like our landing page of all the different things for Oracle Cloud specifically. You can also go to docs.oracle.com. That gives you all the different documentation things that we have for the cloud. But chances are you'll start on cloud.oracle.com, sign up for an account, and then go into the Cloud Console from there, and then kind of like start playing with stuff before you start looking at documentation.
And is there a free tier with the Cloud Oracle?
Yep. So we give, I think it's a $500 credits for folks that, sign up and want to kind of try it out and like play around with the different things that we offer from a cloud perspective. So that's kind of like the free tier that we have today.
Thank you for just taking away my evening.
Sorry, Andrew. Hey, but if you have questions, feel free to ping me. I'll be happy to help.
Well, you said you were going to be here for us all day, so.
All night long, baby.
All night? Well, that's a big promise because I'm more likely to be up all night.
Well, I just have a newborn, so, he keeps waking up all the time. So I'm like available 24/7. That's my SLA right now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And you're all night for sure. Yeah.
I know how that goes. I have a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. So when one of them wakes up, they wake up the other ones, and then that one wakes up the other one. The one who just fell back asleep now gets woken up. So it's a vicious cycle. So I think that's
we call that load balancing.
Yeah.
Well, so is there anything else that we need to know about the Oracle Cloud or Kubernetes in general, or serverless?
I think we kind of talked through a bunch of different things today. So from a high level, basically from a cloud standpoint, Oracle Cloud has all the different features that you would expect from a regular cloud. We pay a lot more emphasis to cloud native. So we have our own registry, which we call OCIR, which is very similar to Docker Hub, but it's an enterprise kind of version of that. So we have that. We have a managed Kubernetes service. We recently released our functions platform, which is a serverless platform that runs FN. So FN project is it's the open source version of the project that we run on Oracle Cloud, and then on the Oracle Cloud we call it Oracle Functions instead. And then we're kind of releasing a bunch of stuff as we go along. But most of the things that we're releasing over time, they're kind of in this whole like cloud native kind of space, cloud native serverless kind of space.
Awesome.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/rogues. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
Well, cool. Is there anything else we want to talk about? Should we move on to picks? Andrew, why don't you start us off with picks?
All right. So when I first got into software development, I was first exposed to developers and not just professors in school and things like that. I was quickly shown iTerm2 and ZSH and all that fun stuff. But recently I've been using something called Archipelago. It's an open source terminal emulator, and I like it way more than I liked iTerm2. It's just a lot cleaner, it's fast, and it's open source, and I don't know, I love it. I would highly recommend if you're sick of iTerm2 or just looking for something new.
Cool. Yeah, that looks a lot like a Hyper terminal. Oh, wait, it was inspired by Hyper.
Yeah, I think he built it on Xterm, I believe. So yeah, he said he's played with Hyper a little bit and kind of built this out.
Cool. And Eric, picks for you?
I got a couple of them. So over Christmas, we had to play it pretty light because expenses and kids. Yeah, kids. Good luck, Karthik. So I got a pretty cheap gift, but it's super awesome. Which is it's a desk mini fridge which holds 6 cans of soda. And I work in my basement, and this machine, I find I use it all the time. It's just this little tiny fridge. I can keep some like cheese in there and a couple of Diet Cokes and whatever I want. But that thing's been crazy useful and fairly inexpensive. The other pick I have is actually very related to what we've been talking about. Now, for me, somebody who doesn't like to do DevOps but still wants the ability to run microservices on a serverless platform, there's a new technology coming out called Asyncy. Now, Asyncy is it allows you to write or consume microservices that have been written open source, and then you can actually orchestrate applications together using their storybook language. So I'm pretty excited about this. I'm actually so excited that I'm going to be giving a talk later this year on it. But Asyncy is they're in beta right now. So yeah, check them out.
I love this website.
Cool. All right, I'll hop in with a pick. So on the Drift and Ruby screencast that I had done a few weeks ago, my audio equipment died on me. So that was not fun, finding out that at 11 p.m., half my audio was destroyed. So I got a new mixer. It's a PreSonus Studio channel amplifier, and it has a compressor and also a built-in equalizer. So that's been my new toy that I've been playing around with. And I actually think that it sounds, I have the same microphone. It has a much better sound than the original mixer that I had. So I've been really impressed with it. Then Karthik, do you have any picks?
So I used to be a Sublime Text guy for a long time, and I would use that, especially when I went to Ruby. I started using Sublime Text a bunch. And recently, like for the last few months, I've been using VS Code for all of my code stuff. And I really like it because it's not really, I used to be an Eclipse guy back in the day, but it's so much like lighter and it just makes my software development a lot simpler. So I would give kudos to VS Code.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking with people who are using them. And then after I, bash them long enough and talk to them long enough, they've switched over to VS Code. So that brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then like there's just so many plugins for it, and it just makes it's fast too. And that's like the part that I'm really like critical about. And Vim and Sublime Text, the reason I used to use both of those is like it was just like fast to use. You can kind of get your stuff done, but VS Code is even better, I feel.
Yeah. Well, cool. If people want to find out what you're working on or find you on the internet, where would people go?
Oh, yeah, great question. So as a part of my team, you can find all the stuff we do on cloudnative.oracle.com. We have like a blog, and then we have a lot of content for like new content for folks that are trying to learn Kubernetes. So that's the learn portion of our site. And so we keep adding a bunch of stuff on there for cloud native applications, Kubernetes, etc. On Twitter, you can find me at iteration1. If you live in Austin, come out to DevOps Days Austin. That's a conference that I host with a bunch of the other folks that are super involved in our community. And then, you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show today and giving us an insight into the cloud native and a lot of the things that you're doing there.
Certainly. Thanks so much, y'all.
All right. Talk to y'all later.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.